conférence, Vincent, c'est à vous.
So it's over to you, Vincent. Good afternoon, Chloe. My name's Vincent Edin. I hope everyone can hear me. I've got a problem with my camera. I'm a journalist with Uzbek and Reka, which is specialized in future and new technologies. And it's therefore ironic that I haven't managed to activate my cameras. There were 8 of us from the Mail trying to get it to work. So obviously didn't do this on purpose. We're with Antoine Fenoglio, who's going to be answering a very complicated question. Solidarity, what will be its post-pandemic legacy? And so that's why we've got that first question up on the screen to see what your memories are from this crisis. Is there anything in particular, anything that you can remember from care workers, patients, inhabitants, or things that you've done with companies maybe? So we're going to, first of all, talk about the etymology, because it's very difficult to talk about anything other than the present, because we're frightened that this crisis will never end. Crisis is the passage from one state to another and will eventually move away from lockdown, curfews, restrictions. And so there'll come the time where we'll have to say, collectively, what will we take away with us from this pandemic so that we can build the world of the future? And in a short essay, which was just published by Sandra Logier and a former minister, Najat Vallaud-Belkacem, it's called The Society of the Vulnerable. And they said, never has care been talked about as much as it has with the pandemic. But alas, never have its precepts been put forward so little. And they continued by saying that we applauded people initially, but it was always very vertical in terms of the decisions that were made for them, and that we've never managed to move on to a more horizontal way of working to help them. But this isn't inevitable, inescapable. There are lots of other things possible. We have seen a lot of solidarity, and I think that design can contribute to this, because it's not only intended to help sell goods. And so in French, we talk about tech for good and design with care, like the one that is promoted by Antoine Fenoglio, who is the co-founder of the Sismo collective. He works with philosophers, mining engineers, and many others. You have a very open, collaborative approach, and you'd like to talk about the future in a world full of more solidarity. And if we think of Black Mirror, we'll have to see whether there could be a bright mirror in the future. So I'd like to ask you to introduce yourself, because if I say that you founded Sismo, which is a design agency that you co-founded that works with 30 designers today and that works in lots of different fields, especially that of health and care, it might be slightly limiting. So would you maybe like to talk about Sismo and talk about the type of people that you work with? Good afternoon, everyone. Sismo initially was just a duo, because I created it with Frédéric Lecourt almost 25 years ago now. And I think we've either followed on or preceded the main movements of the time, because traditionally we come from industrial design. And very quickly we developed an approach whereby we used dialogue with design, especially in culture to start with, and we organized a lot of exhibitions. And then little by little, that dialogue moved on to more structured environments like public services or businesses. And design for us is an opportunity to bring together people's needs via dialogue and via the fact that we can represent things for people and make them available for all different types of audiences. And so that's how we started, and that's how in 2020 we've now found ourselves with a team of 30 people, with lots of people who've got 2 different forms of jobs. So people who are in design, but before that or after that have been either engineers in ethnography, new economies, all sorts of different backgrounds, but with an approach to design which is very much focused on human beings, people. It's probably the quickest way to explain it. And today we're focusing on vulnerability, and that links into the subject that we're going to be discussing. Yes, there's a lot of tension between things that can be sold or not, marketable or not. And there are 30 of you today, and I can imagine that you meet a lot of people, a lot of companies that are quite sensitive to the approach that you use. When you co-founded Sismo, was that the aim? The idea was to open a big design agency that would develop a lot and have a lot of customers, or did you want to have an approach that would seem to be fair to you? Well, we didn't found Cisco saying we were going to create a company. It might seem a little bit of a paradox, but it's exactly the way it worked. We founded Sismo, and I think it's probably good to give you a geographical and historical setting. Frédéric was doing work experience with Michele Lelucchi in Milan in design and architecture. And from the other side of the Alps, it seemed quite striking to see how design could have an approach that was involved in society and the arts, very committed, but at the same time also work in big organizations, because at the time we worked with the Deutsche Bahn and Olivetti without there being any problems in terms of recognizing what design really meant. And so from there, it was the opposite in France, because we had the traditional culture of design, which split design into two, one that was linked to the artistic and cultural side, and which was maybe more engaged in some fields, and then the other side, which was more strategic and helping companies with their business strategies. And those two aspects don't have the same customers, and they don't necessarily do the same work as well. And that's why we created Sismo. But then the success, or as we became more and more successful, we said it might be good to not work on our own, and so that's how we grew. But first of all, it was a way of working on projects, and it was a way in which we were able to do what we wanted to do. And what's interesting is you say that to start with, your co-founder was doing work experience in Italy. So does that mean that you couldn't find what you wanted in France in design at the time, and that's why you decided to co-found your own agency rather than joining another one that already existed? I think that's right, because it's our way of working. We're very independent, and design as a whole, because it's a field which requires you to be free if you want to be able to do things in the best possible way. And that's why we created our organization, because that's the way in which we wanted to operate. I said by way of introduction that you're involved in design with care. Now, I don't know whether you said this, but it might be a way of saying that the rest of the profession is working on design without care. Is that right? You know, it's a bit like saying good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. And so there is one type of design which is more marketable and one that is more systemic. I think that design is everywhere, but I don't think it's a question of a war of words. I think it's a completely different approach. So when you are involved in design whereby you are working on the values or the ethics of care, then you're working on things that are more traditional than in operational design, in the way in which people have worked over the last 20 years. And mainly because we're interested in what makes the care system vulnerable, and whether it be individual vulnerability or in terms of the society or the environment. And it's an approach that accepts that vulnerability could be exogenous to the organization that we're working for. So we're not just working for the benefit of a company or an authority, but we're working on the way in which it is set up or working in a setting. And so if you think of the current situation, then it's something that you'll understand. And that sets the scene for things that are invisible and for people who are invisible. And so we can go and question the way in which we're going to interact with a natural environment, for example. Now, if we continue talking on design with care in 2020, before we go back in history, because it's not the first major crisis that designers have had to work on, but to understand your approach, you say that you are there to lay the groundwork for those who haven't started yet. So you're working on the expectations, and very often we say that People need more time, need to meet more people so that they can feel confident and that they can dare to say what they really think. And do you think that that's one of the distinguishing features of design with care in comparison to other forms of design, is the fact that you think it's very important to meet people physically and that you spend a lot of time in physical meetings with people, and so that's something that has obviously been difficult to do during the pandemic? Yes, in terms of physical meetings with people and listening to people, being very close to them in the field, on the ground, in people's environment, not in our offices or in our setting, that's one thing. But I also think it's important to take the approach of design with care as an approach which is not top-down. That's very important. And so we're really trying, how can I say this? I think it's a strength to maybe use people who don't normally or aren't normally listened to, because it sets them in an environment where we give people the capability or the strength to do things and transform things. And so it's a completely different situation to the situations we've had in the past. And that's why it's really important to be out there with people. And it's very important to accept that we've got to try and fight against the verticality in our relationship with other people. So this vertical idea is that of an organization. So it's vertical from a verbal point of view in terms of the vocabulary, because it's not necessarily the language that we would use when we are talking to others. And it's also very vertical because of the management and the figures that are used. And it's still less expected or understood maybe or desired than when we're in that type of environment. So we've got to reinvent new ways of having a dialogue. And that's why I think that design can be very powerful in the way in which it represents people, in its capacity to create prototypes, when it can experience what's happening really on the ground, and use all sorts of media to help all of the actors or stakeholders in the project to express themselves. And so, it's very rare to go somewhere where you've only got vulnerable people or only strong people. It's more human than standardized. You were talking about the language of figures, and this year it is a terrible year from that point of view, because everybody wakes up in the morning with all of the graphs and charts with figures that help us to understand what's happening. And does that mean that your approach would be without figures? Do you try and work more from an intuitive point of view? It's not a question of intuition. It's that we try and help people to go from management to paying attention. And all of the academic research that we're doing at the moment with the thesis that we're working on with the École des Mines is to try and see whether, nevertheless, we can find criteria that would enable us to prove that the projects that we're working on, the experiments that we're carrying out, can help improve care. Now, it's a problem that is very closely linked to design and art, because it's a problem that's not reassuring for an organization. I think that our role is to try and find the means to change the system, turn it around, but using tools that could be reassuring so that people want to move forward, and so that they don't just believe you and saying, well, that's your intuition and you're very talented as a designer, so I'll believe you. Well, we'll come back to that idea of reassurance later on with the concept that you developed as well of POC, proof of care. And I'd like to come back to what you were saying earlier on with regards to horizontal and vertical ways of working. And the people with whom you interact gave me a quotation, and one of the next year there will be a conference with an architect in Italy who works with a lot of inhabitants, and rather than giving his vision only, Lutin says the inhabitants are the best experts on the place that they live in. And that's what he said. He said the idea is that inhabitants should say what they think and feel, and they shouldn't just look at architecture as a work of art. Is that something that you would recognize in your approach as a designer? I don't think we could not agree with that, but there are a few limits, maybe. And it's the best experts of use, or they are the best experts in terms of the use of the area, but the use is only one area of the creative design process and in architecture. But the best experts of an environment in which we live could also be, for example, a beetle or a ladybird or animals. And so I don't think we can only think of use as a form of single expertise which would enable us to solve all of the problems. And it's a question that I often ask myself, because the risk that we could face is that by giving all of the power of design to those who then use the product on the ground, then we're creating risks. And one of the major risks is that there will no longer be a correlation between the environment and the natural environment, and also a lack of correlation with the system of governance. And that's something I've seen in a lot of projects. Because everyone, and the users first and foremost, even if they're super experts, they have got to be responsible for the way in which the solutions are led or managed, all of the solutions that are going to have an impact on their problem. And so if we all become super users, if we all become super experts, but it's no longer in a democratic framework, I'm saying that in a bit of a harsh way, then I think we're wrong. We're very much mistaken on the super use. And so we've got to try and see how all of this can fit in together, how it can all remain intertwined between the super users that are on the ground, that we've got to listen to, and then all of the other parameters, external parameters, which create society, and that we have to take very big care of. Now, you don't have to answer this, because at least I'm saying that you can try and get out of this. Now, have you got any examples of people who wanted to do good, but in actual fact, they had to stop their design project because it was even less democratic than it should have been? Well, unfortunately, I think it's not as easy as that. Now, I have an example of a project where the users are real drivers of the project. They want to create an environment and a way in which they can exist in that environment, but they decided that for them it would be far more interesting to not be recognized, if you like. So they're saying, okay, we don't need anyone anymore. We're self-sufficient, we're independent, we designed what we wanted, and so we don't need anyone else. And I think that that's a risk that we have to think of and take into account, because the exchange in terms of the political system and the coherence with local authorities who've got to be able to decide on new uses with more care, etc. All of that is key, because if those people aren't involved, then, we're dismantling things on one side but not recreating them on another. Yes, so the risk isn't really democratic. It's just the fact that in design, without realizing or without wanting to, we can find ourselves with an approach whereby we stop everything. Yes, you're right. And also very independent as well, but with a risk, because there's a democratic risk as well, because if we are breaking away from things too much and the governmental structure above the project doesn't fit into the outcome, then there's a problem. Now, we can see what design with care means, and we can see the type of person that would be involved, the type of stakeholder, and we can see what we would need before a project starts. But now, moving on to the subject, of this conference. We're still in the health crisis. Now, it's not the first time that we've had a crisis like this. And this year, all of a sudden, we've had some wonderful examples. I don't know if that's the word to use, but for those of you who are listening to us at the moment, I don't know whether you've answered Leo's question at the moment that he started with. Maybe we can have a look at the type of stories or memories that you have. But those displays of solidarity that everybody heard about. And so is it a question of when the boat is sinking, do we all of a sudden become more humanistic, or is it not that case at all? Now, I would maybe take it from the point of view of design, because it's something I know more about. Historically, in all of the main crises in 1939 or before the First World War, or for the Spanish flu, a pandemic as well, or during the Second World War, there has always been a form of reaction from designers who all of a sudden moved away from their traditional way of working, whereby they worked for capitalism in the 20th century, so that they could start looking at problems linked to the crisis and care with. And there's an example, or two examples maybe, that I like to talk about. The first one would be Yves, the designer of molded wooden chairs, and during the First World War, they were able to really change the industrial use so that they could create splints for people who had been injured during the war, which enabled us to therefore heal wounds in a far better way. So that was one of the things. So Eames making wooden splints during the war. And then after the crisis, the energy crisis in 1973, Fontenec did a lot of work to see what the role of design should be during that period, by trying to understand that the best thing that a designer could do would probably be to stop designing, but with a more committed approach to society, to politics, and more closely linked to care as well, or an approach to care with regards to what the designer is actually experiencing. Now, I don't know whether we could share the comments that people contributed earlier on. Can you see the slide, Antoine? So finishing off things that restaurants hadn't managed to sell, people clapping at 8 o'clock out of their window. So either it's somebody who's a bit cheeky, or, you know, maybe somebody's just saying that it really is a way of showing solidarity. Ah, right, and creating an account so that people can have family video conferences. So that's good. And then shopping delivered to the elderly, and children drawing for carers, and making masks together. So we started about 20 minutes ago, and there are already 5 or 6 memories that we've got on the screen here from people in the audience. So it's the proof that this year, yet again, there have been a lot of examples. Yes, but I don't think the fact that people were clapping has anything to do with design. I think that in the examples that I find very interesting, which happened maybe more directly with the world of design, there was the Decathlon project with the Easy Breathe mask, with that 3D part that was added to the mask, which enabled them to solve problems for people who had problems breathing in hospitals. And we did some studies during lockdown, during that period, and it was amazing to see that solidarity came to the fore in a very surprising way, because it was astonishing to see how Decathlon with the diving and sport should all of a sudden be present in hospitals, in the emergency rooms. And it's amazing to see hundreds of thousands of parts normally for those masks being combined with additive industry, 3D printing, so that it can create some products that are ready to use straight away, and all of the legal and technical problems that would normally have been linked to the creation of a product with patents and specifications, etc. All of those things disappeared. And I think that that's what we were able to see, the way in which we're able to change the field of design and the conditions of design during that period. That's what was amazing. And then also there were designers who drew and designed masks as well. Obviously, they were there as well. But I think it was even more complex than it would have appeared in a more direct, everything happened in a more direct way than it would have normally with health problems. And that sort of complexity is very interesting in this period because it shows how design will probably be taking place in the future and after the crisis. Now, you made a surprising comparison there, because it's amazing to see that so many players are able to succeed in overcoming standards, for example, or legal regulations so that they can do things during the crisis. And you've given us some examples there, but you could also think about some of the fabric manufacturers who've been doing things really different, you know, people who made training shoes and jeans and then all of a sudden changed their workshop completely so that they'd be able to make masks in huge quantities. And we saw that there was a very strong, or people were able to respond very quickly. People displayed resilience. And we've seen that when we wanted to, well, we can do things differently. And that's maybe the starting point of Cynthia Fleury's book, who you work with a lot, because she said that patients can do things. And do you think that we should authorize ourselves to do things more and not just wait for crises? Yes, of course. And I think that a good design project is exactly that. You know, patients can, customers can, and they're not always conscious of that fact. And it's very complicated. It seems very simple to be able to say that the potential is there, but obviously it's complicated, and it's only reasonable that it should be, because the fact that everybody is saying they can do everything all the time, that's a bit of a catastrophe. And so I think, as Cynthia says in her book, for any type of work, a preconceived idea, and design is part of that, would be to say that, yes, we can do something, and customers can, or the person who's placing the order can, or the patient can, and all of that seems to be extremely important. But then after that, to be honest with you, as far as the direct reaction is concerned during the crisis, I think that designers have got to be very wary of where they find themselves, because I've often seen projects that have almost overreacted, whereby people are embellishing the crisis rather than having a more global approach. And that's something that bothers me. It worries me. I think we've got to be careful, because design isn't there just to make everything look wonderful, or just to solve everything that's happening. And sometimes the work that we have to do should be slower, rather than just doing everything in an emergency situation. We're talking about a health crisis, and so the doctors and nurses and all of the carers have got to make do with the situation, because that's what's happened to them. But designers are different, and there are things that shouldn't just be stuck in elegance, and the current world doesn't have to be stuck in a form of design. It's got to move forward, it's got to change, it's got to evolve, but we mustn't accept an image, or we mustn't try and embellish the image so that it's acceptable. I don't think that should be what we do. Now, I don't want to make this difficult for you, but were you thinking about some French luxury brands that were trying to tell everyone that they'd helped the carers because they didn't have the right equipment, that type of thing? No. Because we can't eat in restaurants normally, for example, then we'll have fantastic plexiglass bubbles so that we can go and eat in restaurants. You know, it's that type of thing that I'm referring to. And solving a problem just via a use is not always a solution. I think we've got to be very cautious with that. And not all uses are good for development, sometimes you've got to take a step back and try and see how we can deal with the subject differently, or have a designer's approach which doesn't necessarily just throw itself on the first solution that comes along. So as I said, yes, we're not just going to move into what I call solutionism. I don't think it's a good thing in itself.
You've mentioned it earlier on with that mask, the diving mask of Decathlon. Unfortunately, there were no other participants to mention it, but I have the feeling that in March and April, everybody was talking about it. So that remains an example of an industry that is exogenous to health and that brings a simple and easy solution at a very low price, and something that we can turn industrial. Does it remain for you the best example of inventivity of the crisis? I'd say that's an icon that I believe is interesting. When we look at that mask, I think you know what it's like, with something around your face, pretty big. I think it's nearly comforting. That way we can link two words. The world of leisure, where you can go to the seaside, have a look at fish, and the world of emergency. It's quite a comforting link. And I think indeed it will be an icon that will remain. Many projects have taken place. There has been work on breathing machines and so on, things that have been conceived, designed to adapt to COVID specificity. There are many examples indeed, but this one is visually interesting because it's a mix of worlds. And it also has a material incarnation. You've talked about solutionism. It's a neologism that has been invented by Evgeny Morozov. And he says it's the trend from start-uppers to solve all the problems of the world by creating an application. Of course, here I put aside applications that are only health-related, as for example, Stop COVID, but we've heard a techno-dominating discourse that was to solve all solidarity issues, the wider school inequalities, the reinforcement of job inequalities, difficulties of people who were alone. Everything was going through technology. You could have a Zoom with your grandmother but not visit her. And what's your opinion? What should be the perspective of designers? Because you live in your time and you use the tool of today's world. You've put your camera today, and I haven't done, but it was not voluntary in my case. Technology is pretty practical. Indeed, but practicality is not life. Life is more than practicality. Then to take some examples from the health field, I have a good example in mind. We work for a surgeon who has developed a system of communication with patients in the operation block. It's linked to new technologies, so he can tell you before, after, and live what happens to you during the operation. It's a tool, it's one of the tools to create care in the interaction between two players, the surgeon and the patient. But if you examine the situation from close by, what creates care? It's much wider than that. It will be the link with your family, the link with your employer, with your flatmates, or all players that you meet every day and that will interact with you when you are during the time of care. And maybe among these links, sometimes it's very well to have a technological tool, and at other times, it's not good at all. And it's better to talk to people or have a map in front of you or change use. without turning to the technological channel. Of course, it has a lot of interests, but in itself it does not create all the care that is necessary. Can you keep some distance from it? Caregivers were in contact with reality every day, but some people had to stay at home, and consequently technology was the first link between people, so it certainly has an influence on your imagination, and it leads to believe that all solutions are technological. No, I don't think so. I'm not sure I can explain that, but I have a personal belief at least. I think that the technological link should remain a tool, and we, designers, programmers, we're there to give a mode of thinking next to it, and it's more interesting to do that instead of us being the answer to the problem of use that we face. There's a good work by a designer, Cherubini. He proposes on artificial intelligence to have different scenarios on the same situation. For the decisions of that artificial intelligence, for example, if there is a car crash, you have somebody on foot, you have a family in the car, and you have a truck. According to the technological answer that you want to design, the answer will not be the same about the crash. The choices can be different if the truck is full of gold, for example, or if the family in the car is your family. So I conclude that you would drive over Donald Trump if he were the pedestrian along the road. Is that it? No, I'm not that powerful to decide on that. So we've moved forward here on the kind of memory that we can have about the solidarity during the crisis. And let's take the question that we have on the screen. In terms of the method, if there has been a lot of innovations in the facts, unfortunately, we've remained horizontal in decision-making, and there is a consultation around health, namely with a top-down decision by the minister meeting with the trade unions. When we had thought about that round table at the beginning, you had to be here with Alice Casagrande, who unfortunately is ill. If there are Alice's friends in front of the screen, let me reassure you, she's okay. She was a specialist of support care at home. They were among those who were forgotten in that crisis because they had no say. So we had here another missed opportunity of horizontality. How can you explain that from the design point of view? I think that the debate about verticality and horizontality will not be solved by a time when we can have a switch over. That's not how I perceive things. And here I'm in my role as a designer. I think design has to invent tools to see how we can transform a vertical mode into a more horizontal one. These are the tests that are underway for 3 types of projects and issues. And they're rather in the private sphere for the time being. And there is a big work of construction. It cannot be a vertical pillar that turns horizontal. There is a work of progressive construction to know what we have to win, each of us, in changing the model, a model that has been there for decades. So it's not going to change overnight. How can we change that model, give it some references, criteria of assessment, new tools, give it a format? What will the tools be like? What will we gain in working that way? And then try to create some examples. And when we are in a very vertical environment, and we can't say that the state is not vertical, but we'll have to find means in a way to influence our way of thinking without removing the role of everyone in that switch over towards more horizontality. And here I come back to what Cynthia Fleury was saying when we discussed recently. The risk of the crisis is also the risk of immediateness. Having such changes, we all have to give ourselves the time to do so. We need to know that it will take time. If we all wish to do it in 10 minutes' time or 2 months, we risk being really disappointed on our ability to intervene and change that world. We need to go beyond that risk of disappointment and to dive in our capacity to do something. Maybe it will be lengthy, maybe more time than what we can give at the scale of our professional action. So you've nearly anticipated a question from the audience. We talk a lot of the world of before and after. Is it the same for design? Is the world of design wonder about everything? And what about UX design? Is it in turmoil in their practice? So that's my personal point of view. But what I feel about that crisis is that there is an interesting speeding up of awareness raising. I can't really define why it's so strong in individual terms, but that's what I feel. The people I work with have turned from something that is really far away, kind of systemic environmental crisis. Well, okay, we'll work on it, but in one's own time. They've turned to something really personal, and that's also true for design work. That opens up the questions, the willingness to think it over and to bring solutions. And I like that sentence from philosopher Jan Kelevich, who says, it's not really time to be tragical, it's enough to be serious. And what I expect from that crisis in terms of design is exactly that. Let's not fall into the tragedy. Let's not change it all and have a huge change of anything and everything. But let's be serious and take our part in that necessary transformation. Let's draft the tools that we need. Let's convince the people that we need to convince for that transformation. And let's go for it with a seriousness. And that's also linked to another question. As design is really wide in the practices, are there some spheres that are more impacted than others by the crisis? And we can mention some industries. But did you have more contacts with the catering world or culture? Because theater is always asked to reinvent itself, but maybe there are also limits. Yeah, and we need to be modest, or what I mean is that we need to be aware that design has changed position in the projects. We turn from a design in architecture to design stars that are really vertical in what they propose, that act as very powerful people. The designer is now at the center of a community that is much wider than the designer. If we take the Decathlon mask and the additional part, it's not one single designer who did that. It's a whole full set of skills. And the designer will maybe be the one who links the different people and finds many solutions that will get to the right one. So in terms of fields of action, what I see is that the environments that suffered most are those who fell backwards in their shell, those who closed down the doors and the windows when having a look at the catastrophe that was coming. And that's opening up once again, step by step, with questions, with a kind of a new approach through ethics and design that interests them, and maybe also guided by some design and care approaches, the issues of research in technological industries or linked to inclusion. And I think it has to do with personal beliefs from our rulers, and that's often what makes things change. Our rulers suddenly decide that they have to take another perspective on their action due to the crisis, something more systemic, something harder, more direct, and it allows to change the perspective in front of economy, co-workers, the integration between the social threshold and the environmental ceiling. So time is flying. There is another question from the audience, but maybe we can have others. And I have also one. So the last from the audience, because we've talked about the industries that have changed, that have taken initiative. What about the design of public policies? Is it at a turning point of the truth? So first thing, let me repeat what I've said. I think there is no key time that will be the switchover, but maybe a longer term that we have to accept. So I'm going to answer upside down here. I have rather the feeling that public powers, whatever their size, starts being undermined due to its verticality. In terms of communities that can take in hand several issues, public powers don't have much say anymore. We come to them to ask for money. We don't trust them anymore for the rolling out, and that's a problem. So design can be there for linking them so that it is not falling apart, and the design of public policies is normally well positioned. The risk that I can envisage is that universe can be falling on oneself, isolated. It has to remain open. The design of public policies remain a social issue, environmental issue, and also systemic, and we shouldn't forget that. As a conclusion, if you allow me, we've opened the roundtable starting with Italy. We've moved back there with Decathlon. You have a very international approach of your job, but hospitals, healthcare, the training of caregivers, these are cultural realities that are anchored in a solidarity world, though we're told that we live in a global world, that we have to get inspired from best practices from everywhere. Do you have the feeling that for designers there is a very strong tension between local realities and the need to have a global inspiration? Do you think that it's blocking or not? No, it's not blocking for me. I like the paradoxes that Éluard Morin talks about, globalization or unglobalization. Globalization is a system of everything that's linked to collaboration. That seems to me very interesting. That idea that we can benefit from the networks of collaboration of designers to find better solutions faster, more efficiently. And maybe that does not mean to produce things, but congregating solutions from here and there. and globalization to have a local economy, maybe something that has been damaged, and we need to keep that local autonomy on what is essential for everyone. Here, for example, we have a project linked to health in Mali, Bamako. These are extremely different environments, and though it brings us a lot, so it shouldn't be perceived as a field of constraints, but an opportunity to bring the best at the place where it's most needed. Let's find the right solutions, share them enough so that they can reach the best place. We've mentioned your POC, proof of care. To wonder about care, it's important to develop that in France, and if it can help other caregivers in the world, other systems, that's for the best. Indeed, and it's not only related to health. And I'd like to conclude maybe on that because it's important for me. The dimension of the proof of care is to go from proof of concept and say that design starts for experimentation to prove that the concepts are valid. The concept can be anything. For example, a rocket to reach the moon, because that's an idea that comes from NASA, proof of concept. And it can also be the resolution of a stupid use. Concept can be anything and everything. The proof of care, and I think it's key, means that we wonder if the designer produces care with what they invent every day. And that's to be found in dimensions like health, but any environment. Can what I'm doing produce care? I have to prove it, because I can produce care based on a project that does not reach anything with a team. And then the team can develop some trust, knowledge, tools to better face what they need to manage to transform their organization in the climate condition that we have today. Producing care means tomorrow maybe not creating many objects. Can sound weird for designers, but that's maybe many things that will be more underground, but that we'll have to monitor and be in a capacity to create. In a crisis time, that tribute to the non-corporal is very interesting. You've been proof of inspiration, that's for sure. Thank you, Antoine. Thank you to all of you who have followed us. And Leo, up to you now.